All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us once again for History of the Crested Butte area with Duane Vandenbusche. Thank you so much, Duane, for also being here, of course. My name is Nell Burkett. I'm the curator at the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum. To start off with tonight, as every night, we're going to do a quick land acknowledgement. The museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the Uncompahgre Ute and the Tabawatch Ute were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty. We hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute tribes by History Colorado, our state historic society. While we could never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, and the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. We hope that you will consider supporting this program and all the work that we do at the museum by becoming a member or making a donation, or we're always looking for volunteers as well. You can do this by visiting our website at crestedbuttemuseum.com. Right now, we are doing historic walking tours every Saturday at 2 o'clock. The historic walking tours go up and down Elk Avenue and surrounding areas, and we talk about some of our most historically significant buildings in town. We also do private walking tours for groups of 3 or more at a time that is at your convenience. This program is being recorded and will be available at crestedbuttemuseum.com and on our YouTube page. If you have any questions about our programming, visit crestedbuttemuseum.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can sign up for our newsletter. And of course, whenever we have new information, we always make sure to post it in the local newspaper. Thank you to our lead sponsor, Western Colorado University Alumni Relations. Thank you also to Bluebird Realty and Bill Petros. We will have time for questions at the end of this talk. Be sure to post them in the chat or in the Q&A. And we're also going to have some trivia. And tonight it looks like we've got about 160 people that have joined us this evening. So great turnout. Thanks everybody for being here. All right, Duane, take it away.
Thank you, Nell. Yeah, thanks everybody for being on. Nell tells me we got 394 people signed up and 160 or so on board already. So this is great and I really appreciate it. Today we're going to start with the placer miners and then move over to the lode miners and the silver camps that surrounded Crested Butte. I want to remind everybody that I'll be engaged in sessions through April the 15th. Now there's a good picture, and I'll come back to this. That's a picture of me when I came to the Gunnison Country in 1962, a little down on my luck. I'm panning to see if I can make a little money. I thought you might like that one. I also want to thank our sponsors, and I also want to thank Kevin Sanderford from Colorado Investments, who is providing the book that I'm giving away every week for those who answer the trivia question. So thanks a lot to Kevin. And we'll have that trivia question right after the presentation tonight. We're going to have 30 photos tonight, and I think you'll really like them. They're going to be photos of the 5 great silver camps that were in and around Crested Butte and the Gunnison Country. Topic for next week, we're going to get right down to business and talk about coal mining in Crested Butte. That's what made Crested Butte what it is today. So thanks everybody for being on board, and here we go. When I talked to you last time towards the end, I talked to you that the Gunnison Country was beginning to open a little bit slightly, maybe just a crack in the door. John Gunnison was here on a railroad survey. Took about 3 or 4 days going through the Gunnison Country in 1853. He didn't stop. He just kept right on going. And then the door opened up a little more with placer miners in the 1860s. And that's where I'd like to begin today as the Gunnison Country now begins to open. There was evidence of 49ers going to California, stopping in Taylor Park en route to see if they could find gold. But obviously California was the place where the real gold was, and they kept right on going. When you talk about placer gold, you're talking about gold panning. And this is free gold. It's called shot wire, grain, flour, dust, and nugget. It doesn't need any smelting. You just put it in your saddlebags and ride away. Now that is the day of the individual miner. And you're looking at a guy with a gold pan. And he's going to scoop a little debris out of a stream, have water in it, gently rotate that slightly downhill. As you can see, all of the light dirt floats off. What's left in the bottom of the pan are little pebbles, too heavy to float out. And if you're lucky, black sand or gold, which is heavy and does not flow out. It sits on the bottom of the pan. And then the miner would take forceps and take the pebbles out very carefully. And then he would pour a little mercury in the bottom of the gold pan, and mercury amalgamated or linked up with gold. And then he would burn the mercury off. And what was left in the bottom of the pan was always called pay dirt, the dirt on the bottom of the pan that paid. In the 1860s, this was the decade of placer miners in the Gunnison Country. Around Crested Butte, they panned up near the head of Rock Creek, today the Crystal River. They also panned up to the head of Washington Gulch in a town that later on would be called Elkton. They panned Coal Creek and the Slate River. And they were at Armstrong Gulch in Pitkin. And they were in Snowblind Gulch near White Pine. And they were along the banks of the East River. But the two of the most well-known miners of the time weren't very far away from Crested Butte in the 1860s. One of them had come in from the town of Granite in the year 1860, and he crossed over Lake Pass following an old Indian trail, and he came into the north end of Taylor Park. And he looked down into the park and he saw all these streams that came into the park. Bowman Creek, Illinois Creek, Texas Creek, Cottonwood Creek, and many others. And he recognized that as probably pretty good placer mining country. So he went back to Granite and he brought some more guys in, about 4 more guys in later in the year. And they panned, and one day, the guy's name was Jim Taylor, and one day the horses got away and Taylor went after the horses, and he was tired. He got the horses and he scooped, had a tin cup, and he scooped a little water under Willow Creek to take a drink, and he was able to pan out a ½ an ounce of gold. You keep that in mind for a little later on in our talk today. In 1861, Taylor came back, but he was followed by a guy named Fred Lottis, and he lost Lottis, and Lottis was lost trying to come in today where Gunsight Pass is above Ohio City. And when Lottis dropped down Gunsight Pass into what Lottis Creek is called today, he came into an adjoining park that he thought was the park where Taylor had been. And that park today is known as Union Park. Jim Taylor's park, of course, became known as Taylor Park. And in 1861, when the Civil War beckoned, Jim Taylor went back to fight for the South. He was from Georgia, and he never returned to the Gunnison Country. Fred Lottis went out to fight for the North, but he came back. And until 1885, when he sold his diggings out for $50,000, he panned out about $5,000 worth of gold every summer. And you can still see his diggings along Lottis Creek, South Lottis Creek, right where the Taylor Park cow camp is today, a Union Park cow camp is today, not too far away. You can still see those diggings. One of the ways that the individuals would get into the Gunnison Country very early, placer miners, of course, came in pretty much by walking in. But one of the guys who ran a stage line, we're going to talk about a little later on, was a guy named Ben Holliday. And Ben Holliday had the best horses and the best men and was the fairest guy. And he ran an express from 1861 to 1866 in the West, including in Colorado. And there's a famous story told by Mark Twain in Roughing It when he said that a young man who once had visited, had been in one of Ben Holliday's coaches in the West, was visiting the Middle East, and he ran into an old guy who was there for religious reasons. And the old guy said to the young fellow, he said, "Jack, do you see that range of mountains that bounds the Jordan Valley? Mountains of Moab, Jack, think of it, my boy, renowned in scripture history. We are standing face to face with those crags." And then dropping his voice impressively, he said, "Our eye may be resting at this very moment Where lies the mysterious grave of Moses? Think of it, Jack. And Jack said, Moses who? Moses who, said the old guy. Jack, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You ought to be ashamed of such criminal ignorance. Why, Moses, the great guide and the poet and the log river of ancient Israel. Jack, from this spot where we stand to Egypt stretches a fearful desert 300 miles across. And across that desert, that wonderful man brought the children of Israel, guiding them for 40 years over the sandy desolation and among the obstructing rocks and hills, and landed them at last safe and sound within the sight of this very spot. And where we now stand, they entered the promised land with anthems of rejoicing. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do, Jack. Think of it. And Jack said, 40 years, only 300 miles. Hell, Ben Holiday would have got him through there in 36 hours. Jack obviously probably missing the point. Of all the mine, when the miners began to come into the Gunnison Country and Crested Butte in the American West, there was a famous song sung by Debbie Reynolds in How the West Was Won that typified the miners who came in. You didn't want to know too much about them. And it's called What Was Your Name in the States? And I'm going to give you a couple of verses. What was your name in the States? Was it Thompson or Johnson or Bates? Did you happen to draw on your mother-in-law or sink the old lady with weights, my friend? Oh, what was your name in the States? What was your name in the States? Was it Murphy, McDonald, or Gates? Did you hold up a bank as a juvenile prank and pack up the money in crates, my friend? What was your name in the States? What was your name in the East? And how recently was you released? Are you riding the rails because you held up the males, or was it the females you held, you beast? Or what was your name in the East? Or what was your name in the States? Though you suffered the cruelest of fates. Way out here in the West, everybody's a guest. So line up and fill up your plates, my friend, whoever you are in the States. And that said a lot about what went on in the mining country of Gunnison and the surrounding area. By 1870, the placer mining was finished. The streams had been tapped out, the Indians were dangerous, it was cold, the seasons were short, and now it remained to the middle 1870s, about 1874, when other miners began to come in, and these guys were called hard rock miners or quartz miners or lode miners, L-O-D-E. These are the individuals that found most of the gold, but now they had to go deep into the bowels of the earth, 500, 600, 700 feet down, and then you crisscross every 100 feet or so with a tunnel. And what you're trying to do is intersect the mother lode or the vein. And when you find it, you follow it. The day of the individual miner is now over, because this takes a lot of men, a lot of money, and a lot of technology. And they used to say that good gold is $200 to the ton. And that meant that you brought up 1 ton of muck and debris and rocks from deep into the bowels of the earth. And gold at that time sold at $20 an ounce. Somewhere in that 1 ton of muck and debris were 10 ounces of gold times $20 an ounce equal $200. And your job was to find that 10 ounces of gold in that 1 ton of muck. And that was a real problem because Colorado's gold ore, according to a metallurgist, could only be reduced by a long and complicated and expensive process. And by the late 1860s, there was no known way of reducing the Colorado gold ore until a great metallurgist from Johns Hopkins University was sent into Colorado to take a look at the Boston and Colorado mine at Central City. And he took samples to the #1 miners in the world. If they couldn't reduce it, it probably couldn't be reduced. Wales, the Welch. So by wagon to the Mississippi River, by train to the East Coast, and by boat to Wales. And the miners in Wales were able to reduce the Colorado gold onto a copper matte or base. 5 years later, Nathan Hill was able to figure out how to get the gold off the copper base, saving Colorado's gold industry and silver industry, became a United States Senator and a multi-millionaire, and in my opinion, one of the most important men who ever lived in Colorado. Great strikes now began. Lake City, Ouray, Telluride, Silverton in the San Juan, Aspen on the Roaring Fork, Leadville at the head of the Arkansas River. All the miners who came in were following the Colorado Mineral Belt. That is a belt 250 miles long, 50 miles wide. It starts at Caribou near Nederland and Boulder in the north and goes in a southwesterly direction all the way down to Durango. Every great precious metal mining area in Colorado is in that mineral belt except one. And that's the greatest of them all. And that is Cripple Creek Victor, which is an extinct volcano and which is outside of the mineral belt. Aspen, Colorado became the #1 silver town in the world, producing $100 million worth of silver in one decade from 1880 to 1890. 11,000 people, 10 trains coming in every day, and a nugget out of the Smuggler Mine that weighed 2,060 pounds, 93% pure silver. One problem with Aspen, however, until the late 1880s, it didn't have a railroad. And now we take a look at the Gunnison Country, which now began to open up. Prior to this time, it had a bad reputation for the few people who came in. Cold, a lot of snow, tough Indians, isolation. Alonzo Hartman had run the Gunnison Cow Camp for the Ute Indians in 1872. Sylvester Richardson brought the Gunnison Colony in 1874. But it wasn't until the great silver camps around Crested Butte began to open that thousands of people began to come into the Gunnison Country. And you're looking there at the start of Irwin City. And you can see all the tents, and they even got a bakery in the year 1880. The lake that we now call Lake Irwin was originally called Lake Brennand, with a D on the end after early miner Jim Brennand, who had been in the area in 1872. And that lake is right at the spot where Anthracite Creek flows west and Coal Creek flows east. And then a miner who had been one of the Pony Express riders, who had served a term in the Colorado legislature, came in, very prominent guy, and they named the new town after him. And it now became known as Irwin. The original name had been Ruby, after Ruby Silver. Dick Irwin was the miner. And not only did they name the town after him, but they changed the name of the lake. And today it is Lake Irwin, in the shadows of Ruby, Owen, and Purple Peaks. And to give you an idea how pretentious Irwin was in the early days, there's the two-story Hotel Belmont in 1882. Irwin had a legitimate 4,000 people in and around the gulch. All of the miners came in, not the way you might come to Irwin today, to Crested Butte and then following Coal Creek in. They came rather up Ohio Creek and passed a place called King's Ranch at the base of Ohio Pass, crossed the pass, and then made their way into Irwin. And Irwin is exactly the same elevation as Ohio Pass, 10,033 feet. And there is Irwin, about 1882 in the wintertime. A road soon connected Irwin to Crested Butte. And that one was a famous Pioneer Wagon Road that ran from Irwin to Crested Butte. And today, part of it is a mountain bike trail. John E. Phillips, great newspaper editor, started the Elk Mountain Pilot. And there you get a good look at Irwin when it first got started. And some of you folks have heard of D. May and F Company. Well, there's where it got started in the early mining camps. There's D. May and Company. And if you look in the background, you can see a sign that says Reasonable Abe. In the year 1881, the great newspaper reporter Nellie Bly, who had been around the world in 80 days fame, came to Irwin to report on a booming mining camp, and she was taken skiing by Johnny Phillips and a bunch of miners, and she wasn't much on skis, and she upset head first in the snow, and everybody laughed at her. And when she got out of the snow, she wagged her finger on Johnny Phillips' nose and said, "Sir, it's pretty obvious to me that you are no gentleman." And Johnny Phillips was equal to the task, and he said, "Madam, after seeing you in the snow, it's also obvious to us that you are no gentleman." There, ladies and gentlemen, is the Irwin School, about 1882. Great minds in Irwin: Force Queen, Bullion King, Ruby Chief, Ruby King. The Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad was headed in the year 1882 when the boom began to bust. Now, that previous photo, you saw people on Lake Brennan or Lake Irwin. Now we go to the next one, and you can see one of the main drags of Irwin in the wintertime. And you can see they got some pretty prominent buildings. Even though the South Park never got into Irwin, you can still walk along the grade that they graded almost in. If you go up Ohio Creek, you can walk along the grade. The reason that Irwin plummeted, James Grant of Leadville, the great mining man, came in and he said Irwin had knife blade seams. In other words, the seams of ore were very thin. The weather was terrible. You could only mine about 6 months out of the year. And then came the silver panic of 1893, which finished off Irwin, which had already been falling. Price of silver plummeting to 58 cents an ounce. In the 1960s and 70s, a grand old man named John Hahn, who was in the Air Force, came into Irwin, and he would mine the Forest Queen mine for 3 or 4 weeks over the summer, and he'd go back to the military, and he'd make about 10 feet every year. He just wanted to do it as a hobby. And you went to John's cabin, the door was always open, and there was a little note on the counter that said, "Take anything you want that is available to you. Just the next time you come, replace it." Grand old man. Now we move to the second great camp in the Gunnison Country, and that is Gothic. And Nell will put that up on the board here, and there it is, with Gothic Mountain towering in the background. And that is Gothic in 1880 as it opened up. Ferdinand Hayden was the guy who stood on top of Mount Teocalli in 1874, looked at Gothic and Crested Butte Mountains and called them the Crested Buttes. But later on, he thought the Gothic Peak more resembled a Gothic cathedral, and there it is. And they dropped the S from the Crested Buttes, and we got Crested Butte Mountain. Gothic Peak's about 12,500 feet. 3,000 people located at the junction of the East River and Copper Creek. And there you can see it. And when you go into Gothic today, you go right up that road, go up a little hill, and then keep right on going out there towards Schofield. Wire silver was found, especially at one of the great mines in Gothic called the Sylvanite, located about 3 miles up Copper Creek. Jack trains carried ore from Aspen over East Maroon Pass, through Gothic, and to the railhead at Crested Butte. 500 of them, because Aspen didn't have a railroad. And then they would stock up on supplies and go through Gothic, over East Maroon Pass, and bring the supplies back to Aspen. There is a great shot of the 3-story high Gothic Hotel, about 1882. Gothic had 3 of them. They also had 3 smelters. Garwood Judd was the guy who became famous in Gothic because he had a movie made about him called The Man Who Stayed, put out by Fox Movie Tone News. Gothic went down in 1893 with the Silver Panic, but Garwood Judd, who would come in 1881, stayed. Go back to the previous photo, Nell, if you would. So Garwood Judd State, there's a really good picture, folks, of the hotel. That's a pretty prominent hotel for Gothic. And Garwood Judd became known as the man who stayed. He would die in 1931. There is the Sylvanite mine, and they are stockpiling ore in the wintertime for shipping it out in the spring or early summer. In 1928, a Western State professor, Dr. John C. Johnson, started the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Gothic, and it became famous. It's now, since 1928, in its 93rd year, and they do some of the great scientific studies on climate change and global warming. And there is a picture of Garwood Judd in 1929 with his dog. Today, another legendary guy lives in Gothic and has been there for about 44 years. Some of you may have met him, and that is the legendary Billy Barr. We now go to the next great mining camp, and that one is located near the head of Tamichi Creek. So as you go, start heading up Monarch Pass, you take a left-hand turn, and 10 miles up the Tamichi, you come to the town of White Pine. 2,000 people. There you're looking at the Hotel Rom, 1884. 3 great mines, the Magna Carta, the May Mazeppa, and the Akron Tunnel. And here's a good shot of one of the stores in White Pine, and that's in 1884. One of the real prominent things that you see in White Pine in the fall of the year is the famous Liberty Bell. There is the White Pine Town Band. All these mining camps had bands. All these guys knew how to play instruments. Of course, we get over to Crested Butte with Pete Dunda. Pete will talk a lot about that, and I'll kind of back him up after I learn a little more from him. But the next photo should be, well, no, that's the stage. And, you know, it's a very primitive stage. And that is the stage that ran from Sargent's all the way to White Pine, 10 miles, and then went 2 miles further up into the town of Tamichi. One of the prominent features that everybody sees in the fall of the year, it's located at a place called Battle Mountain. And there is the famous Liberty Bell. And you can see that every fall. Those yellow color, you can see the yellow, but the lighter stuff, those are aspen trees, and they are growing in the midst of evergreens. Almost a perfect Liberty Bell. So the country must have been thinking about White Pine in the early days. In 1899, an avalanche 2 miles above White Pine off a peak called Granite near the town of Tamichi killed 4 people and wiped out Tamichi as a mining camp forever. White Pine, however, was not finished. In World War I and World War II, White Pine produced tremendous amounts of lead and zinc for the war effort. And there you're looking at the Callahan Lead and Zinc Mill in White Pine in the 1940s. It employed 50 men. The miners had a ski area, rope tow for the children. It was the 3rd largest town in Colorado at that time. And then after the war ended in the late 1940s, it closed up. There is one of my favorite photos. This is a young mother on skis with a guide pole and her son in a snowdrift box mounted on a sled, and she is going to take him from White Pine 10 miles to the railroad at Sargent's. Tremendous photograph. Today, if you go into White Pine, you better be on your best behavior, because the Los Angeles Police Department, wouldn't say the department, but many members of the LA Police Department own homes in White Pine. And the name obviously came from the pine trees nearby. One other town that is right above White Pine is the great town of North Star. And if you go beyond North Star, you go to Water Dog Lakes, and then you're in the Monarch country. We now come to another great mining camp, and this one is Pitkin. And there's a shot of Pitkin about 1882, right along Quartz Creek. And right near Pitkin are three great passes. One of them is called Cumberland Pass, 12,015 feet that drops you down into Tin Cup. The other two are Tamichi and Hancock passes, which will get you all the way over to the eastern slope and into St. Elmo and down Chalk Creek and into the eastern slope area. The original pass that you used coming from Tin Cup to Pitkin is an adjoining pass that was long before Cumberland. It's called Napoleon Pass. And you can still see it from the top of Cumberland Pass, which is 12,015 feet. Pitkin had 4,000 people. And there is a great story attached to the town of Pitkin. There it is. There's the main drag looking west. And here is the story of Karl Warrenski. Karl Warrenski was from Poland, and he was forced to work on board a Russian ship which docked in San Francisco in 1861. And he escaped, and he made his way to Colorado, and he fell in with some other men. And they made their way over the divide, and they began to placer mine in Armstrong Gulch, right about where Pitkin is today. And they found good gold. And as long as they had trinkets to give to the Ute Indians were okay. But when they began to run out of trinkets, the Indians got a little bellicose. So these guys knew they needed to get out of there. And they took their gold and they put it in a wooden box and hid it under the cleft of a big rock. And unfortunately, the Indians caught them trying to leave, and they killed every one of the 7 except Warrenski, who hid under and a bunch of rocks. They didn't find him. And he made his way to Denver. And about 3 weeks later, he came back with 5 or 6 more guys to bury the bodies. They didn't want to tell anybody of the gold. So he went back to Denver, found that his mother was ill in Poland, and he went back to Poland. And there he was captured by the Russians as a deserter. And he spent the next 19 years in a Russian prison before he got out, returned to the US, came back to Armstrong Gulch, and was shocked. Nothing looked the same. The town of Pitkin was there with 3,000 or 4,000 people. Nothing looked the same. And after looking around for a while, he kind of gave up, walked into the Pitkin Miner newspaper office where a guy named Dutch Henry Scherenbeck was there. And he told Scherenbeck the story. And Scherenbeck had also mined in Armstrong Gulch 20 years before. And he kind of knew where Warrenski was talking about. And they went underneath that rock where they hid the gold, and they found it. And Karl Warrenski, there's a great story about this, walked into the Pitkin Miner newspaper, gave Scherenbeck $1,000, took out a 20-year subscription, and left, never to be heard from again. The Denver South Park and Pacific ran into Pitkin. That's how they got heavy machinery in. That is an 8-horse team pulling in a boiler in the early 1880s. The South Park Railroad, however, came through the Alpine Tunnel and ran right through Pitkin. And that was a very big deal. Not far from Pitkin and near the head of Armstrong Gulch is a great peak called Fairview. And on top of Fairview, they got a stone house. And that was a place where a forest lookout, and scarred by lightning strikes today. And the Forest Service has done a pretty good job in fixing that up. 3 places still exist in Pitkin today from the old days. The Pitkin Hotel is still there. The stamp mill, the remains are still there. The railroad station is still there. And the City Hall, built in 1900, is still there. In 1882, while building the railroad, and there's the South Park making its way into Pitkin, double header. 2 engines. In 1882, a fight broke out between 2 Negro teamsters working for the South Park over a card game. And one of the guys, Thomas Coleman, shot and killed another black man named Thomas Smith. Coleman was brought to Gunnison, and in December of 1882, he was hung, the first legal hanging in Gunnison, right by the courthouse. Pitkin began to fade like everything else in the year 1893 when the silver panic hit. It is located at 9,200 feet. White Pine, incidentally, 9,500. Gothic, 9,400. And of course, Irwin, 10,033. That takes us to our next slide and our next town. And the next town is a very beautiful town, most appropriately called Tin Cup. And now we go back to that story I told you a little earlier about Taylor panning a ½ an ounce of gold out of Willow Creek. The original name of Tin Cup was Virginia City, but the post office made them change that name because the damn mail was getting confused between Virginia City, Montana and Virginia City, Nevada. So they decided in a big meeting they would name it Tin Cup, and became Tin Cup in 1882. The 2 legendary guys who had been there before, we've already talked about Jim Taylor and Fred Lottis. The first town located in that area, about 2 miles to the north of Tin Cup today, is the town of Hillerton, located by a New Yorker named Edwin Hiller. Hiller began the first newspaper in the Gunnison Country, and it was called the Hillerton Occident, June 1879. Unfortunately, all of the mines were located more towards Tin Cup, and Hillerton faded from the scene very early, with everybody going down to Tin Cup. Tin Cup was settled very early by a group of renegades from the Black Hills Gang, Deadwood, Lead, Custer City in South Dakota. So they were lawless. 3 marshals were killed in Tin Cup. Now there is a great photo. Everybody asked me how they got that heavy machinery in. Now this thing, I don't think you can see all the horses, but there's 8 or 10 of them right there. And I think this is a 12-horse team. That's bringing in a boiler. And a lot of times they cut those boilers in half because they were too big to bring in at one time. And you can see it's in the spring of the year. So they're coming in over Tin Cup Pass, 12,154 feet, down past Mount Kreitzer and right into Tin Cup. The great mines of the Tin Cup area had names like the Gold Cup and the Tin Cup and the Anna Dedrica and the Star and the Enterprise at the north end of the park. About 3,000 people lived in and around Tin Cup. And one of the prominent peaks that towers above Tin Cup is a mountain called Mount Kreitzer, Kreutzer. And that was named for the first forest ranger in the Gunnison Country, William Kreitzer. And there's a great book about him called Saga of a Forest Ranger. And he had a tough time dealing with cattlemen and sheepmen who engaged in a war with each other, with over 1,000 sheep being bludgeoned to death in Taylor Park. Taylor Park is 30 miles long, 8 miles wide, and the Ute Indians referred to it as the Garden of the Gods. Now there you get a great shot. The dam of today is just in the back. This is a car that somehow got this far about the 1930s. And I don't know if a slide came down. I think it probably did. I don't know how it got there, but it sure as hell not going through that slide. Many great passes come off of the Sawatch Range, towering above Taylor Park. Sawatch Range has got 15 mountains, 14,000 feet or better. But most of the streams come off 13,000 foot peaks with names like Grizzly and Ice and others. And they come down Illinois Creek, Cottonwood Creek, Cow Creek, Bowman Creek, whole bunch, Tellurium Creek, all the way down. Lake Pass, Taylor Pass, and then Cottonwood Pass, 12,126 feet. Here's a trivia question you can stump your friends with. It is the highest paved road over the Continental Divide in the United States, having been paved about a year ago on the west side, beating out Independence Pass by 31 feet. There is the building of the Taylor Dam, which was built from 1935 to 1937 by the Bureau of Reclamation. And you can see the Taylor River in behind it. You don't see that today because that's part of the Taylor Reservoir. That dam was built from 35 to 37, and it backed up 106,200 acre feet of water, an acre feet being 1 foot of water covering 1 acre. And that water is owned by the Uncompahgre Water Users Association of the Uncompahgre Valley around Montrose and Olathe and Ridgeway. It is an earthen dam. We'll see another picture coming up here in a moment. It is 85 feet high. It is built on a geologic fault. 300 men built it. It was built for $2.8 million. And they are considering hydroelectric power. Now, one of the final photos I'm going to show you, maybe the final photo, I'll tell you a little story. 1975 or so, I'm finishing a book on the Gunnison Country, the big one. And I get a letter from Chatham, Massachusetts. And the letter came from a guy named Carl Foster. He's the guy on the left. And Carl Foster said, I heard you're working on the Gunnison Country. I was the mining engineer for the Enterprise Mine from 1908 to 1914. I have slipped a lot in the last year. I'm now 92 years old. And I wanted you to have these photos. And he sent me 100 photos in a box of the early days of Taylor Park and the mining area there, the Enterprise Mine, Star Mine, and so on. Now, the guy next to him is a Forest Service guy named William Sheldon. So about 4 or 5 years ago, they put in an interpretive sign at Dorchester, which is right near the Enterprise Mine, north end of Taylor Park. And I gave them the information and photos that they needed. And they said, well, Vandenbusche, how do you want this put? Who do you want to say gave us this? And I said, I don't want my name on this at all. You're not going to get the photo or the stuff unless you say compliments of Carl Foster, one of the greatest guys I never met. Always wished I could have met him. I don't know why in the hell I didn't. Maybe I didn't have his phone number. Maybe he didn't have a phone number. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Those are the silver camps of the Gunnison Country. Next week, we're into coal mining. Now, I want everybody to pay attention because here comes, for a book on Crested Butte, pictorial, here comes the trivia question. Who were the 2 placer miners who crossed the Saguache Range in 1861 and found gold in 2 great parks in the Gunnison Country? Wow, we're getting all kinds of answers there.
Right.
I think Lynn was first, but she's already got a book. She's answered first every time. I'm going to let you decide, Nell.
Well, we've got Angie next. And I don't think Angie's won anything.
Yeah,
yet.
what'd she say?
Taylor and
That's
Lotus,
it.
Lotus?
We'll get her address and her book will be on the way tomorrow. Now, are there any questions that anybody has regarding the placer mining or the silver camps we've just covered? Any questions?
Yeah,
lay it on me.
We did. We had a question from Emily. How did the horse-drawn wagons with the boilers get downhill without rolling out of control?
Because they had brakes on the front wheels and brakes on the back wheels, and sometimes they dragged a heavy log to slow them down.
Joel asks, I remember Duane said last week that Cochetopa means mountain stream. In what language?
The Ute language. That is what Chief Uray told Alonzo Hartman.
Ashley asks, could you say the history of Tin Cup's name again?
Yeah, the Tin Cup was named by Jim Taylor in 1861, looking for his horses, stopped to get a drink out of Willow Creek. He had a tin cup, scooped out water, saw a little gold in the bottom of the stream, and panned out a half an ounce of gold and made a note of it. And then when they came back the following year, they went into Willow Creek. But unfortunately, the war began, and that was it. So they became known as Tin Cup, original name Virginia City.
All right. And then we also got a question in email today from Lee. A display at the Crested Butte Museum says that the first recorded use of skis in the Gunnison area is 1857 by a group of neophytes lost and looking for Cochetopa Pass. Their snowbound leader, Jim Baker, fashioned snowshoes. Her question is, what was going on in 1857? Why were they there in Cochetopa Pass area? What were they looking for? And who is Jim Baker?
Jim Baker was a great mountain man, and he was with Randolph Marcy. And what they were doing, the Mormon War had broken out. The Mormons were against the U.S. government because of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This is a long, involved story. But they were going back towards Santa Fe to bring in more troops and more supplies. And Jim Baker knew the area real well, but still it was a big snow year and they almost didn't make it.
Ashley asks, I've heard that the old building behind the stash where the fire department and RMBL and CBLT have offices was originally built as a mining office of some kind. What was it built for?
I'm going to have to plead ignorance on that one, Ashley. We're going to leave that to Nell maybe to help me find out. I don't know. I'd have to go and take a look at it.
Chris asks, name of pass south of Tin Cup Pass, northeast of Neapolitan Pass through the Continental Divide?
Well, the only pass that I know of that parallels Cumberland is Napoleon. And Napoleon was used very early. The original name of Cumberland Pass was Pitkin Pass, but I don't know of any other pass that was used to go from Tin Cup to Pitkin except Napoleon and then later on Cumberland.
Okay. Robert asks, earlier in the previous week, you mentioned the Augusta Mine. Was it near Irwin?
The Augusta?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
the Augusta Mine is located up Poverty Gulch. And it's about, I'm going to guess, about 4 miles up Poverty Gulch. And we'll be talking about that. You know, it's 4 miles from Pittsburgh. And we'll be talking about that later on. That was an authentic great mine, and it had a tram that was wiped out by an avalanche. And a number of guys were killed trying to come into Crested Butte. It's great history. Tony Stroh and her husband live at Pittsburgh, and I've given a talk for them up there. So, and I gave them a lot of my notes on the Augusta. That's one of the real great mines of the Crested Butte area.
Bobby asks, did the Utes ever show any interest in mining?
None. They weren't interested in that. They were interested in food. You know, there wasn't much they could use mine or mineral wealth for.
Carol asks, do you know when mining stopped at the Sylvanite mine?
The Sylvanite mine, I have to look at my notes. Carl Haas wrote a great master's thesis for me called Gothic, City of Silver Wires, which they have over at Gothic. I'm going to say about 1893 with the silver panic. It didn't shut down right away when things began to go down, but I think it operated until about 1893.
Okay. Bill asks, what does the word placer mean?
Placer simply refers to the side of a stream, hence placer mining. And you go into the stream, it's gold panning, basically the same thing.
And then Emily asks, how long was the dredge used in Tin Cup?
Yeah, you know, I didn't have enough time to get into that. The dredge was put in the 1880s. And I'll tell you what a dredge is. A dredge is a floating mill, and it rips up the bottom of a stream bed to about 20 or 30 feet. Very bad environmental way of mining. If you go through Fairplay today, you're going to see all kinds of gravel on the side of the streams, and that's the excess that the dredge kicked out. So if you find gold in the bottom of the stream of the gold pan, you're going to find more, they thought, 20 or 30 feet down. Now that dredge near Fairplay sat there for 20 years until taken to Argentina, where it's used today.
Andrea asks, where did the buildings in Irwin go?
Well, some of the buildings in Irwin came to Crested Butte, including the Elk Mountain pilot. Many of the buildings simply fell into ruin, like a lot of other mining camps, but John E. Phillips moved his newspaper office down. The church wound up, I think, in Crested Butte also. And there were a number of other buildings that went into Crested Butte. But of course, when things began to fade and all the snow that you got in that area, a lot of those buildings just collapsed.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Annie says, who did Duane say was the greatest man in Colorado history, had Welsh help with gold?
One of the greatest men, Nathan Hill. He's the guy who found out how to reduce that complex Colorado gold ore. Later on became a senator and a multimillionaire because of his process.
Okay. We got a lot of questions tonight. Here we go.
That's good.
The South Park grade over Ohio Pass, was it headed to Irwin? I have seen a picture of the unfinished South Park grade above the Denver and Rio Grande Western grade going into Floresta.
Yeah, you know, the Rio Grande was the one that ran into Floresta. The Rio Grande ran from Crested Butte right along Coal Creek, and then just before you get over to Kebler Ohio Pass, you can see it going into Floresta another 3 or 4 miles. The South Park, if you go up Ohio Creek, you go past the town of Baldwin. As you head up and you look on the right side of the road, you can see what the locals call the Chinese Wall. And that is a stone wall that would hold the rails in. So the South Park Railroad graded pretty much almost all the way into Irwin. But then the boom busted and that was it.
Another Mitch says, curious about the Alpine Tunnel, blah, blah, blah. Curious about the Alpine Tunnel and associated legends.
You know, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a quick one on that, but I'll hold off on that till we get to the railroads. The Alpine Tunnel was used by the South Park, 1,771 feet long. I've been in it about 6 or 7 times. You can't go in today. But let's hold off on that one till we get to the railroads, when I'm going to spend about 20 minutes on it.
Okay. Lynn asks, what about the large coal breaker at Floresta? What happened to that breaker?
Yeah, the coal breaker pretty much was done about 1928-29, and then was dismantled, and the timber was taken into Crested Butte and used by local people or by the CF&I big mine. 5 stories high.
Shelley asks, why is it called the Chinese Wall?
They call it the Chinese Wall because now not a lot of Chinese worked on it, but some Chinese worked on the wall. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you while I'm at it, with regard to the Chinese, they built the first transcontinental railroad from Sacramento all the way to Promontory Point. And when Charlie Crocker, the construction boss, started to hire these guys, everybody said, "You're crazy as hell. Those guys are 5 feet, 210 pounds. There's no way they can build a railroad." But the Chinese were the best workers in the world because you could lower them in baskets in the American River Canyon to drill dynamite holes to blast. And here's a trivia question, see if anybody can answer it. Ask my class all the time. The Chinese workers never got sick. $64 question is, why did the Chinese workers never get sick? Heavy emphasis on the never. Very good. Who's that? Rutherford. They drank boiled tea. And we all know the germ theory of disease. The way you kill germs is to pasteurize it or boil the hell out of it. And that's why they never got sick, because they didn't drink contaminated water like the Irish did.
All right. Our next question from Mark. Are there mine tailing issues in this area similar to what there has been around Ouray?
Well, there are mine tailing issues in this area, but I wouldn't say they'd be in the same category as Silverton, especially. And you could also say probably Telluride, although Telluride's done a pretty good job of handling theirs, and Ouray. And the major reason is that we did not have a long time of precious metal development. You know, we just weren't a great precious metal area. So we don't have those big tailings ponds that they had in the San Juan, like the Gold King, which is legendary for having broken and contaminated the Animas River.
Yeah. Michael asks, I would like to know what you know about Butch Cassidy and his partner Sundance. Spent some time in Crested Butte. What do you know?
Oh, you mean Robert Redford and Paul Newman? Well, here's the legend, and I think it's probably true. The Cassidy gang went into Crested Butte. They were on their way to Dinosaur National Monument in Browns Park, and then en route on the Outlaw Trail. That's where they hid out, Browns Hole, Browns Park. And they stopped in Crested Butte to get a beer. And Butch and Sundance walked in, and they had a rule, you had to hang up your gun belt, which they did. And while they were drinking their beer, one of the gang outside yelled, "Here they come." And Sundance grabbed his gun belt, ran outside. Butch forgot his, and they rode away before the posse. And that gun belt and six-shooter was left in Cocheevers, and the Cocheever family has it today. May or may not be true.
All right. The next question from Patricia. Are there any original buildings left in Gothic?
Well, yeah, the one that they fixed up, the Old Town Hall, is an original building, yes. You know, they've got that one fixed up real nice. You can buy books, you can buy a drink in there. They fixed it up really good. So yes, right on the right side of the road, about middle town as you're heading out to the north.
And there's also, we did a National Historic Preservation Month webinar series with Duane, and we had Ian Billick, who's the director of Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, whose offices are in Gothic. And he talked all about the historic buildings that they've rehabilitated and the ones that are part of their history there. And you can find that on our YouTube page and learn all about Gothic's buildings. Great. Next question from Robert. Was Irwin the highest settlement?
In the Gunnison Country, yes, with one possible caveat. Schofield was pretty close, because Schofield Pass is 10.7. Schofield is below that, so Schofield will be pretty close, but yeah.
Okay. And then our last, I believe this is our last question from Stephanie. What was mined for at the Crystal Mill?
Well, the Crystal Mill was not a mining mill. It was a power mill, and it used water power that ran a 100 horsepower turbine that powered 3 mines on the other side of the road. So it never was a mill that processed ore. It's the second most photographed spot in Colorado behind the Maroon Bells.
All right, we made it through all of our questions. Thank you, everybody, for your really great questions tonight.
Yeah, anybody want to get on the chat board, go ahead. Always like to see who's on. Thanks, everybody, for getting on.
Yeah, while everybody's posting in there, remember, if you'd like to support this program or the museum, you can become a member or donate or volunteer at crestedbuttemuseum.com. We'll be back again next week. What's our topic next week, Duane?
Topic next week is going to be coal mining. We're going to talk about the Jokerville, talk about Floresta, talk about the 9 coal mines around Crested Butte. So we're going to go from precious metal to coal.
All right.
Mike Burns, hi. Holly, hi. Thanks for being on board. Terry, you too. Bill, good to see you. Keep chatting. I'd like to see all of you folks. Rick, nice to see you. A whole bunch on. How many were on tonight?
We had around 175.
Well, that's fantastic. We'll maybe hit 200 next week. Carol, thank you very much. Appreciate your family very much. Thanks, everybody, for being on board. And hi, Jim. Yeah, keep them coming. I'm not in any hurry here.
Also, thank you to our sponsors.
It's great to see where everybody is from Dallas.
Thank you.
Good to see the California boy and the ex-CEO of the Ajax Aspen Ski Mountain. Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you to Western Colorado
Hi,
University
Vicki.
Alumni Relations, as well as Bluebird Realty and Bill Petros. Thanks for helping make this program possible.
All right, folks. Thanks a million. Over and out. See you next week.